The air inside the Audubon Ballroom felt heavy that Sunday afternoon, almost suffocating. It was not the heat, it was the tension. Hundreds of people sat in the folding chairs, but the usual buzz of excitement was missing. Instead, there was a nervous energy, a collective holding of breath. At exactly 3:10 p.m., a scuffle broke out in the middle of the crowd. A man shouted, "Get your hand out of my pocket!" Heads turned. Eyes shifted. It was the perfect distraction. Before the crowd could react, the deafening roar of a sawed-off shotgun tore through the room. It was followed quickly by the sharp cracks of semi-automatic pistols. On the stage, the man who had spent his life speaking for the voiceless didn't run. He didn't duck. He simply stood there as the blast knocked him backward, his blood staining the wooden floor. In the front row, a pregnant woman threw her body over her screaming children, trying desperately to shield their eyes from the horror unfolding just feet away. This was not just a murder. It was a public execution. He knew they were coming. He had told his family that morning that he was living on borrowed time. Yet, when the bullets flew, the police protection he needed was strangely absent. They killed the man, hoping to kill the message. But who really pulled the trigger? And more importantly, who stood in the shadows and watched it happen? The truth about Malcolm X is far more disturbing than the history books have ever admitted. The story of Malcolm X did not begin with a speech. It began with a fire. Long before the world knew his name, he was Malcolm Little, a boy born into a world that seemed determined to erase him. His first memory was not of a lullaby, but of terror. In 1929, in Omaha, Nebraska, the Ku Klux Klan rode into the night, surrounding his family's home, smashing windows, and demanding that his father, Earl Little, come out. Earl was a preacher, a man who dared to spread the teachings of Marcus Garvey, preaching black pride in an era that demanded black submission. That defiance painted a target on his back, a target that would eventually extend to his son. The violence was relentless. When the family moved to Lansing, Michigan, hoping for peace, the hatred followed them. One night, while the family slept, their house was set ablaze. The white firefighters stood by and watched the structure burn to the ground, offering no water, no help, just silence. Young Malcolm watched the flames consume everything his family owned. It was a lesson he would never forget. In America, the law was not written for people who looked like him. But the true tragedy arrived 2 years later. His father's body was found nearly severed in two by a streetcar. The authorities called it an accident. The black community called it what it was, a lynching. The insurance company refused to pay the life insurance policy, claiming it was suicide. This was the moment the system first failed Malcolm X, leaving his mother, Louise, alone to fight a losing battle against poverty and grief. The slow disintegration of his mother was perhaps more painful than the sudden death of his father. Louise Little was a proud, educated woman, but the crushing weight of raising 8 children alone in the Great Depression, combined with the constant harassment from state welfare agents, broke her spirit. They treated her not as a grieving widow, but as a case number, a problem to be solved. Eventually, the state declared her insane and committed her to a mental institution. The children were scattered like seeds in the wind, sent to various foster homes. Malcolm was a bright student at the top of his class, even elected class president. But the dream of integration shattered when a favorite teacher told him that being a lawyer was no realistic goal for a nigger. That sentence killed his desire to fit in. He dropped out of school, realizing that no matter how smart he was, the world only saw his skin color. He fled to Boston to live with his half-sister, Ella, and there, the transformation began. The bright-eyed student died, and a new persona was born, Detroit Red. He was mesmerized by the nightlife, the music, and the sharp suits of the city hustlers. He learned to straighten his hair with lye, enduring the burning scalp to look more like the white man, a symbol of self-hatred he would later despise. He moved to Harlem, New York, diving headfirst into the criminal underworld. He became a creature of the night, a pimp, a drug dealer, a thief, and a numbers runner. He carried a pistol and lived on the edge of a razor blade. He wasn't just surviving. He was at war with society, taking what he felt was owed to him by any means necessary. He was angry, lost, and dangerous, a product of the very system that had destroyed his family. But the fast life has a short fuse. In 1946, at just 20 years old, the law finally caught up with him back in Boston. He was arrested for a string of burglaries. However, the judge's harsh sentence of 10 years was not just for the stolen watches and jewelry. It was punishment for his relationship with a white woman. He was thrown into Charlestown State Prison, a place of concrete and steel designed to break men. At first, he raged against the bars. He was so defiant, so filled with hatred for God and the Bible, that the other inmates nicknamed him Satan. He paced his cell like a caged panther, his mind rotting from the drugs he could no longer access. It seemed this was the end of the line, just another statistic in a long history of black men lost to the prison industrial complex. Yet it was in the silence of that cell that the miracle happened. Influenced by a fellow inmate named Bimby, who commanded respect with words rather than fists, Malcolm began to read. He realized he was inarticulate, unable to express the storm inside him. He got a hold of a dictionary and, in a display of sheer willpower, copied every single page, word for word from A to Z. With every word he learned, the bars of his cell seemed to dissolve. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and religion, reading late into the night by the faint glow of the corridor light. He was educating himself, arming his mind for the battles to come. Then came the letters from his siblings. They told him a man named Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. They told him that the white man was the devil, a concept that resonated deeply with a man who had seen his house burned, his father killed, and his mother driven mad by white society. He stopped eating pork. He stopped smoking. He began to pray. He wrote to Elijah Muhammad every day. The teachings gave context to his suffering. They explained that his condition was not his fault, but the result of a systematic erasure of his history. When he walked out of prison in 1952, the criminal known as Detroit Red was dead. In his place stood a man with a new purpose, a razor-sharp intellect, and a new name. He replaced the slave name Little with a variable X, representing the unknown African name that had been stolen from his ancestors. Malcolm X had arrived, and America was not ready for him. By the late 1950s, Malcolm X was no longer just a man. He was a phenomenon. If the civil rights movement was a slow-burning fire, Malcolm X was the gasoline poured directly onto the flames. He didn't just join the Nation of Islam. He weaponized it. When he walked out of prison, the organization was a small, obscure sect with barely 400 members. Under his tireless leadership, within a decade, it swelled to over 40,000. He was not merely a minister. He was the greatest recruiter Black America had ever seen. He traveled from city to city, establishing temples in the heart of the ghettos, speaking to the drug addicts, the unemployed, and the forgotten. He told them, "You are not an American. You are a victim of America." It was a message that cut through the noise because, for millions, it was the absolute truth. During this era, Malcolm X became the angriest black man in America in the eyes of the white media, a title he wore not with shame, but with the pride of a warrior. In 1959, the documentary The Hate That Hate Produced beamed his face into millions of living rooms. For the first time, white America saw a black man who was not asking for permission, not begging for integration, and certainly not turning the other cheek. He was terrifying to the establishment because he was intelligent, articulate, and completely fearless. He debated scholars, politicians, and civil rights leaders at top universities like Harvard and Oxford, dismantling their arguments with a razor-sharp wit and a smile that disarmed his opponents even as he verbally destroyed them. He didn't use complex academic jargon. He spoke plainly, using metaphors that hit like a heavyweight boxer. He famously said, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made." While Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching about a dream of sitting at the table of brotherhood, Malcolm X was telling his people to build their own table. He argued that integration was a fantasy as long as black people did not own their own economy, their own communities, and their own minds. He introduced a radical concept to the masses: self-love. In a time when black features were mocked and straightened hair was the norm, he preached the beauty of black skin. He made men stand straighter and women walk with their heads held high. He was the spine of a community that had been beaten down for centuries. He wasn't just fighting for civil rights. He was fighting for human rights, arguing that the plight of the black man in America was an international crime that should be taken to the United Nations. His influence extended far beyond the podium. He became a spiritual father to a young boxer named Cassius Clay, guiding him toward the faith and standing by his side as he shocked the world to become Muhammad Ali. This friendship symbolized the reach of Malcolm X. He was capturing the hearts of the strongest, most talented icons of the generation. He was the alternative to the passive resistance that many young people were growing tired of. When police brutality occurred in New York or Los Angeles, it was Malcolm X who showed up, not to sing "We Shall Overcome," but to organize, to investigate, and to demand justice with a sternness that forced police chiefs to negotiate. He commanded a disciplined army of men, the fruit of Islam, who stood silent and stoic, a visual representation of black power and discipline that commanded respect on the wildest streets. However, his skyrocketing fame came with a heavy price. He was becoming bigger than the organization he served. While he constantly deferred credit to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, ending every speech with praise for his leader, the media focused solely on the charismatic spokesman. Jealousy began to fester within the hierarchy of the Nation of Islam. The man who had resurrected the movement was now seen as a threat to its leadership. Malcolm X was working 18-hour days, driving himself to exhaustion, pouring every ounce of his soul into the cause, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crack. This period was the zenith of his power. He was the most televised, most quoted, and most controversial figure of his time. He forced America to look in the mirror and see its own ugliness. He didn't offer the comfort of forgiveness. He offered the cold, hard reality of consequences. He famously declared, "We are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us." It was a warning, a declaration of the right to self-defense that terrified the status quo but empowered a generation. Malcolm X had built a fortress of words and ideology that seemed impenetrable. But as the 1960s roared on, the enemies were no longer just outside the gates. They were inside the walls, sharpening their knives. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. For Malcolm X, the ground began to crumble not from the outside, but from the very foundation he had built his life upon. The year 1963 brought a revelation that shattered his spirit more than any police baton ever could. He discovered that Elijah Muhammad, the man he revered as a divine messenger, the moral compass of the Nation of Islam, was violating his own strict teachings. Rumors of adultery had circulated for years, but Malcolm X had dismissed them as white propaganda. However, when he spoke directly to the young secretaries who had borne Elijah's children, the undeniable truth hit him like a physical blow. The father figure he worshipped was a fraud. He felt a profound sense of spiritual betrayal, a wound that left him isolated in a movement he had largely built with his own sweat and blood. The political news tightened in November 1963, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The entire nation was in mourning, and Elijah Muhammad had issued a strict order: silence. But when a reporter thrust a microphone in his face and asked for a comment, Malcolm X could not hold back his nature. He described the assassination as a case of the chickens coming home to roost, meaning that the violence America had exported around the world and inflicted on its own black citizens had finally come full circle to strike its leader. The comment was incendiary. The media branded him a monster. The Nation of Islam used the incident as the perfect excuse to silence him. He was officially suspended for 90 days, but he knew the truth. It was an indefinite banishment. The jealousy that had been simmering among the leadership had finally boiled over. They didn't just want him quiet, they wanted him gone. In March 1964, Realizing the doors were locked forever, Malcolm X announced his formal break from the Nation of Islam. It was a dangerous move. He was no longer protected by the fearsome reputation of the Fruit of Islam. He was now their number one enemy. Stripped of his rank, his car, and his steady income, he found himself alone. But in this isolation, he found a new kind of freedom. He decided to go to the source of his faith. He boarded a plane for the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. What happened in the desert transformed him completely. For years, he had preached that the white man was the devil incarnate. Yet, in Mecca, he saw blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims eating from the same plate as Africans, praying side by side in true brotherhood. He realized that the problem was not white people. It was white supremacy. He wrote a letter back to the States that shocked everyone. I have eaten from the same plate and gathered with fellow Muslims, whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. The man who returned to America was no longer just Malcolm X. He was El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz. He was no longer preaching racial separation, but global human rights. He was ready to take the plight of the American Negro to the United Nations, charging the U.S. government with human rights violations. This evolution made him infinitely more dangerous. To the Nation of Islam, he was a traitor who knew their deepest secrets. To the FBI and the U.S. government, he was now an international threat capable of uniting African leaders against American policies. The surveillance on him intensified. His phone was tapped. His every move was trailed by agents. But the threats from his former brothers were the most visceral. In the pages of the nation's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, Louis X, later Louis Farrakhan, wrote that a man like Malcolm X was worthy of death. It was not a subtle hint. It was a green light. The psychological warfare was relentless. He told friends, I live like a man who is already dead. On February 14, 1965, just 1 week before the end, the threats turned into fire. While Malcolm X, his pregnant wife Betty, and their 4 daughters slept, Molotov cocktails shattered the windows of their home in East Elmhurst. The house erupted in flames. Malcolm ushered his family out into the freezing winter night, standing in the snow in his underwear, watching their sanctuary burn. The police response was sluggish, and fire officials later accused him of setting the fire himself to get publicity. It was a cruel, final insult. He had no home, no money, and no protection. He tried to get a permit to carry a pistol for self-defense, but the police denied it. The system was stripping him naked before the wolves. February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom. He shouldn't have been there. He was exhausted, stressed, and separated from his family due to the threats, though they came to see him speak that Sunday. The atmosphere backstage was grim. Malcolm X told his aides, I probably am a dead man already. When he walked on a stage, he looked out at the 400 people. He usually began with Assalamu alaikum, but the response was cut short. The disturbance began. The man yelled about the pocket. The distraction worked perfectly. As the shotgun blast tore into his chest, creating a circular pattern of pellet wounds, time seemed to stop. He fell backward, his hand clutching his chest, knocking over 2 chairs. Then came the executioners with the pistols, firing shot after shot into his prone body. 1 bullet struck his chin, others his legs. It was overkill. It was hatred manifested in lead. The room descended into pandemonium. Women screamed, chairs were overturned, and smoke filled the air. Betty Shabazz fell to her knees beside him, crying, They killed him. They killed my husband. She tried to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but the blood was everywhere. Malcolm X, the man who had stood tall against the might of an entire nation, lay dying on a cold stage in Harlem, surrounded by the people he loved, betrayed by the brothers he trusted, and watched by a government that wanted him silenced. The lion was dead, but the echo of the gunshot would ring forever. When the smoke cleared at the Audubon Ballroom, the narrative was written almost instantly by the mainstream media. The headlines did not mourn a human rights activist. They blamed a violent demagogue. The New York Times editorialized that Malcolm X was a man who preached brotherhood, but usually to the sound of violence. The message to white America was clear and comforting. This was a gang war, a feud between thugs that had naturally resolved itself. But to the streets of Harlem, to the revolutionaries in Africa, and to anyone paying attention to the details, the official story smelled of a cover-up from day one. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in negligence, or perhaps calculated efficiency. Within days, the police arrested 3 men: Talmadge Hayer, a member of the Nation of Islam who was caught at the scene, and 2 others, Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson. The police declared the case closed. Justice, they claimed, was swift, but there was a glaring problem. Butler and Johnson were not there. They were known enforcers for the Nation of Islam. Yes, but on that specific day, they had alibis. Yet, the system needed bodies, and it needed a quick conviction to bury the political implications of the assassination. The trial in 1966 was less of a search for truth and more of a theatrical performance. Talmadge Hayer, the man who was actually caught with a gun, took the stand and confessed. But in a stunning twist, he testified under oath that Butler and Johnson had nothing to do with it. He shouted to the courtroom that his accomplices were not the 2 men sitting beside him. He even offered to name the real shooters. The judge refused to listen. The prosecution buried the evidence. The jury, overwhelmingly white and terrified of the black Muslims, convicted all 3 men. Malcolm X was dead, and 3 black men were sent to prison for life. The book was closed. America moved on, but the question remained: who really wanted Malcolm X dead? While the triggermen were certainly foot soldiers of the Nation of Islam, evidence that surfaced decades later pointed to a much darker reality. We now know that the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had declared Malcolm X a primary target of CONTLPRO, a secret counterintelligence program designed to neutralize black nationalist leaders. Hoover was terrified of the rise of a black messiah who could unite the militant black groups. The FBI had infiltrated the Nation of Islam at the highest levels. They had informants surrounding Malcolm X, some even on his own security detail. The most chilling revelation is not just what the FBI did, but what they didn't do. They knew about the threats. They knew an assassination was imminent. Yet, on that fateful Sunday, the usual uniformed police detail that stood outside the Audubon Ballroom was mysteriously pulled back. The NYPD's Special Unit, the Bureau of Special Services, BOSS, had undercover officers in the room when the shooting started. They saw it happen. They did nothing to stop it. They did nothing to catch the real shooters in the chaos. The silence of the authorities was louder than the shotgun blast. For decades, Norman 3X Butler, who later changed his name to Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, Khalil Islam, rotted in prison for a crime they did not commit. They lost their youth, their families, and their reputations. It wasn't until 2020, following a relentless documentary series that re-examined the evidence, that the Manhattan District Attorney finally agreed to reopen the case. What they found was appalling. The FBI and the NYPD had withheld crucial evidence during the original trial, evidence that would have cleared Aziz and Islam. They had files indicating who the real shooters were, but kept them hidden to protect their informants within the Nation of Islam. In November 2021, 56 years after the assassination, a judge formally exonerated Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam. The courtroom erupted in applause, but it was a hollow victory. Khalil Islam had died in 2009, never seeing his name cleared. Aziz, now an old man, stood with dignity and said, "The events that brought us to court today should never have occurred." It was an admission by the American justice system that they had framed 2 innocent men to protect the secrets of the state. The world finally saw what Malcolm X had tried to tell them all along. The assassination was not just a result of a rivalry. It was a convergence of interests. The Nation of Islam wanted him silenced for his betrayal. The FBI wanted him neutralized for his politics. It was a perfect storm where hate met opportunity. The real tragedy is not just that a great man died, but that the machinery of justice was weaponized to hide the truth. Malcolm X was right when he said, "I'm for truth, no matter who tells it." It just took America half a century to be ready to hear it. They buried his body in Ferncliff Cemetery, but they could never bury his voice. For decades, the history books tried to paint Malcolm X as the villain to Martin Luther King Jr.'s hero, the violent shadow to the peaceful light. But that is a lie designed to make us comfortable. The truth is, Malcolm X was not a man of hate. He was a man of profound, unshakable love. He loved his people enough to tell them the ugly truth about their condition. He loved them enough to stand in the line of fire, so they could learn to stand tall. His greatest legacy is not a law passed in Congress or a holiday on the calendar. His legacy is written in the posture of every black man and woman who refuses to lower their eyes in the face of injustice. Before Malcolm X, the world told black people to be ashamed of their hair, their skin, and their names. He taught them that black is beautiful before it was a slogan. He replaced shame with dignity. He replaced fear with a spine of steel. He showed the world that you don't need permission to be human. You simply claim it. In the end, the bullets could not kill the idea. The man who once called himself a dead man walking lives on in every protest against police brutality, in every demand for equality, and in every heart that refuses to compromise on the truth. He showed us that the price of freedom is high. Sometimes it costs everything, but the cost of silence is even higher. Malcolm X did not live to see the old men who were wrongfully convicted for his murder finally walk free. He did not live to see the movement he sparked change the world. But maybe he didn't need to. He did his part. He woke us up. And now, the question isn't who killed him. The question is, what are we doing with the truth he died to give us? Some stories end without closure. But dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs a witness. To anyone who has ever stood alone because it was the right thing to do, we see you. If this story stirred something in you, or if it reminds you of the price of standing up for the truth, share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to uncover more history that they try to hide.